This will be a lecture, Introduction to Biblical Archaeology, with some emphasis on the relevance of biblical archaeology for the historical books of the Old Testament. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. What is archaeology? Archaeology is the systematic recovery, analysis, and interpretation of surviving evidence of human activity, to quote Keith Scoville. There's two types of surviving evidence. There's epigraphic evidence, that's writings, and then there are artifacts, which are objects. Biblical archaeology seeks to use the evidence of archaeology to understand the world of the Bible better, and thereby to gain insight into the Bible itself. Now, what's the extent of biblical archaeology? Well, there's a broad definition and a narrow definition. The broad definition geographically covers all lands where biblical Israel or the New Testament church had contact. And so that would include Egypt, Palestine, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Persia, the Mediterranean world, Spain to India, Ethiopia to South Russia. And then chronologically, by the broad definition, there's no limit. It covers the time of biblical Israel, but it covers the time before biblical Israel, Paleolithic onward, and it covers after biblical Israel, the Byzantine period of 324 to 640 AD, when many churches and shrines were founded on holy sites, and the Islamic period from 640 to 1099, the Crusader period from 1099 to 1291, on through the modern period. The more narrow definition of biblical archaeology is the study of those findings of archaeology that are of direct or at least indirect evidence to the Bible, or Bible times, places, or peoples. Now, what's the relationship between the Bible and archaeology? The Bible traditionally has been used by archaeologists as a main historical source to inform their interpretation of biblical sites. For example, knowing from the Bible that a site was originally Canaanite, and then taken by Philistines, and then taken by Israelites, could allow an archaeologist to look for Canaanite, Philistine, and Israelite levels in the archaeological dig. Archaeology is used by Bible students to inform one's reading of the Bible. The value of biblical archaeology for biblical studies. Biblical archaeology is valuable in many ways. It's valuable for biblical geography. Biblical archaeology has aided us in locating many biblical sites. Ancient sources may help us to find sites. For example, the Bible mentions Kaftor as the homeland of the Philistines. We know from Akkadian sources that Kaftor is somewhere in the vicinity of Crete and the Aegean Islands. Often biblical sites have kept their old names but garbled through Arabic, and so we look to modern sites and their Arabic names to sometimes figure out the ancient names. And we can, from biblical archaeology, figure the layout and population of places. Biblical archaeology has also been very valuable in establishing biblical chronology. Specifically, synchronisms with Assyrian kings is the first step in placing absolute dates to events during the time of the monarchy. This is the way that it works. Assyrian sources gave each year of a king a name. And we have a complete set of year names for Neo-Assyrian kings from 910 to 649 BC. These are in what are called Limu lists. And from a solar eclipse on the 15th of June, 763 BC, known from astronomy, that can be correlated with a year name in the Assyrian list of year names, and thus allow all Neo-Assyrian kings to be given absolute dates in the year BC. So from that complete set of year names, from the Limu lists of Neo-Assyrian kings, and from a correlation between an eclipse mention in those and what we know from astronomy, we can date those kings to the year BC. Synchronisms between events mentioned in Assyrian texts that are also mentioned in the Bible form the starting point for dating biblical kings. And there are many synchronisms that we could look at. For example, there was a battle called the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC. You can see on the map on the left where that battle was. In 853 BC, Shalmaneser III fought with Ahab and a number of other kings, and that's recorded in his monolith inscription. Ahab of Israel is known from the Bible, and we know he fought with Shalmaneser III in the year 853 BC, so he has to be alive in 853 BC. We also have an inscription where Jehu is said to pay tribute to Shalmaneser III on the 18th year of Shalmaneser. That's recorded on Shalmaneser's black obelisk. Here you see a picture of either Jehu or his emissary bowing down before Shalmaneser III. That dates this event to 841 or 840 BC, and so Jehu had to be alive. Jehu, king of Israel, had to be alive in 841, 840 BC. Another inscription in 740 BC, Menachem paid tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III. That's recorded in a Nimrod inscription. In 734 BC, Ahaz paid tribute to Tiglath-Pileser as well. That is recorded in 2 Kings 16 and verse 10. It's also in a summary inscription of Tiglath-Pileser. And again, Menachem must be alive in 740 BC, and Ahaz was alive in 734. In 732 BC, Pekah was deposed and Hosea was placed on the throne. And that's from 2 Kings 15 and verse 29. But Tiglath-Pileser in the summary inscription refers to his invasion in 732. We also have the fall of Samaria that's recorded in 2 Kings 17 and verse 6, but it's also recorded in the Babylonian Chronicle and can be dated to 722 BC. In 720 BC, we have a second capture of Samaria, 2 Kings 17:6, and also we have Sargon II, his Annals of the Second Year, that records the same event. In 701 BC, we have Sennacherib's campaigns. They're described in 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19. There's a parallel in Isaiah. It's also recorded in Sennacherib's own annals, where he said he had Hezekiah like a bird in his cage in his royal city of Jerusalem. And from Sennacherib's annals, we can actually tell the course of his armies, how he came and fought against the Egyptians at El Takeh, also how he went and besieged Lachish and then came around and besieged Jerusalem, and another army came from the north at the same time. This is all recorded in Sennacherib's annals. We also have in 674 and 668 BC that Manasseh paid tribute to Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, and that's in the Esarhaddon Prism B and the Ashurbanipal Prism C. Here's a little bit about Sennacherib's besiegement of Lachish. He actually put that on his palace wall, scenes of that, including impaling some of the inhabitants. That is now found in the British Museum. These synchronisms were used by a man named Edwin Thiele, who wrote a book called Mysterious Numbers of Hebrew Kings, published originally in 1951, where he worked out a chronology of the kings of Israel and Judah based on these synchronisms and taking into account co-regencies where one king had kind of retired and his son was acting king, and different calendars and the like. Anyway, the chronology that Thiele came up with is still widely used today. The chronology before the period of the monarchy is much less well established. In another lecture, we have a discussion on the book of Exodus of the date of the Exodus, and that can vary by centuries depending on which chronology you end up following. Another thing that biblical archaeology can do is to give us everyday life and customs. Archaeology can show the kind of clothes that people wore, the kind of diet that they ate, the size and style of their dwellings, hairstyles for women, how they buried their dead, how they laid out their cities, and so forth. Here we have a wall relief of Semitic tribesmen. This is a wall relief in Beni Hassan, Egypt. But anyway, 37 Semitic tribesmen came to Egypt, and you can see how the Semites from Canaan dressed. And of course, it can affect interpretation of other things, hairstyles and head coverings. Archaeology in the New Testament is also a value for that. 1 Corinthians 11 talks about head coverings. Biblical archaeology also gives us a world history backdrop. We know from archaeology about the Hyksos in Egypt, and knowing about the Hyksos in Egypt aids one in explaining why there was an oppression of the Hebrews. The Hyksos were powerful Semitic rulers that controlled the Nile Delta region and had influence up into Palestine. But then when they were defeated by the king of Upper Egypt, Ahmose, in 550 BC, and he drove them out, well, that would give him a reason to oppress the Semites that remained in the Nile Delta region, and that would have included the Hebrews. It also gives us more information about the worldviews of peoples mentioned in the Bible. Mythological texts and artifacts show us what people thought about their gods like Baal and Marduk and Dagon and Ashtaroth and other gods and goddesses. Liver omens give us insight into the magical practices in which they engaged. Here on the right we have an image of the goddess Ishtar. It also tells us something about the texts of the Bible. The recovery of ancient manuscripts can be used in textual criticism, and that's, again, a part of biblical archaeology because they were discovered by archaeology. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found via excavation, and that changed our understanding of what the original text of the Bible probably was. And archaeology also affects the New Testament. Here in the corner, I have a picture of the John Rylands fragment, P52, which has a fragment of John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33. Dates to around AD 125, making it the oldest New Testament fragment ever found. Hebrew and Aramaic have been clarified by the study of related Semitic languages discovered by archaeology. Those related languages include Ugaritic and Akkadian. And here you see the Ugaritic alphabet on the left. But anyway, from Akkadian, we learn that the Hebrew word Heikal, which is translated either temple or palace, is a loan word from Sumerian. Sumerian had the word Egal, which means big house, A is house and gal means big. So Agal means big house. It was loaned into Akkadian as Egalu, and then it was loaned into Hebrew to Hekal. And so we know the derivation of that particular Hebrew word based on archaeology. It's also interesting that patriarchal names fit into the formulation patterns of the Amorites and the Akkadians of the early 2nd millennium BC. They fit the time period that the Bible says that they were in. Biblical philology is helped by archaeology. In Greek, Hellenistic papyri found in Egypt have clarified the meaning of Koine Greek words, and Moulton and Milligan in the 1930s produced a dictionary that incorporated evidence from the papyri in our understanding of Greek vocabulary of the Hellenistic period. And one of the major Old Testament texts of the Hellenistic periods, one of the versions is the Septuagint. And so our understanding of these papyri can affect our understanding of the Septuagint, which in turn can affect our understanding of the original Hebrew texts and also the interpretation of the Hebrew based on what the translators of the Septuagint understood it to mean. We also have Akkadian, which has affected things like our understanding of the name Habakkuk. Habakkuk was thought to mean something like embrace. But the cognate term was found in Akkadian in a list of garden plants. So it may be that Habakkuk was named after a plant instead. We have some English names named after plants. The English name daisy and the name rowan is actually named after a type of a tree that gives berries. Biblical archaeology can also be used apologetically to defend the reliability of aspects of the Bible. Now, archaeology cannot prove the Bible because archaeology only gives us the surviving remains of the past. And the central supernatural claims of the Bible leave no remains. So we can prove that Ur existed from archaeology, but we cannot prove that God called Abram from Ur. Now, of course, some liberal scholars will use archaeology to try to disprove the Bible as well. It is true, though, that the Bible can confirm some things. It confirms that certain persons or places or events described in the Bible are historically accurate, and that the text can be shown to have been reliably preserved. But there are limits to archaeology. Only a small percentage of possible excavations have been done. And so lack of evidence may mean only that we haven't dug enough yet. At the site of Gibeon, there were 4 years of excavation before finding any evidence for occupation in the biblical period. If they would have quit after 3 years, they would have said there was no occupation. They just had to dig further. Another problem is that some excavations have been poorly done. In the 19th century, archaeologists, quote unquote, were by and large treasure hunters who raped sites and destroyed the evidence. And once they did that, that made it hard to use later on. Early 20th century archaeologists lacked good techniques for scientific excavation. And some scientific excavation results somehow never get published properly. So they found stuff, but they don't record it in such a way that they can be used by other scholars. Another problem is that characteristics of a site may make it difficult to interpret correctly. Erosion may mar a site. You have Dibon, which is in Moab, modern-day Jordan, is known to exist in the late Bronze Age because we have Egyptian epigraphic sources, an inscription of Ramses II that mentions Dibon, but the whole period is missing in excavation. And erosion may be the problem. Jericho is another site that suffered considerably from erosion. Sites could also be tampered with by ancient construction projects. The digging of pits or wells, the leveling of a site for construction could mess up levels for archaeologists today. Certain materials don't preserve well, and many materials don't preserve at all. In biblical times, they often used papyrus rather than clay for writing, particularly in Israel, which was close to Egypt, where they could get papyrus. But nearly all papyrus have perished, with the only exception of places where it's extremely dry, like along the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved. But everywhere else, it deteriorated and no longer exists today. Of course, we moderns have the same problem. A lot of paper has acid in it, and over the course of decades or centuries, deteriorate. You also have the use of mud bricks, and mud bricks can melt away into surrounding mud and become indistinguishable from simply being mud. Archaeology deals then with the wrecks of time, in that most of what once existed has long since been lost. Talk about Stone Age men. The reason they're called Stone Age men is because the artifacts that we have are made out of stone, but they use things other than stone. It's just the things that they used have not survived as long as that. And then yet another problem with archaeology is that sites can be misidentified, leading to false conclusions. Sites can shift, for example. There are 3 sites called Jericho. There's Old Jericho, Tel Es Sultan, which was abandoned in Hellenistic times. But then there's Hellenistic and modern Jericho, which is Er Riha, which is a little bit down the road. It's a different place than Joshua's Jericho, though it's given the same name. And then there's a third site from Hellenistic Roman times, Tubul Abu el Alaik, where a palace was built. It was also called Jericho, but it's not in the same place as the other 2. Sites can also be misidentified. Archaeologists once thought the Laish was Lakesh. Note the similar Arabic name, Lakes and Lachish, sound alike. But it turned out that that's wrong. It's not the Old Testament Lachish. Tel Ed Duwer was the true Lachish. Ai may be misidentified as well as Et Tel, thus explaining the lack of evidence from the late Bronze Age when Joshua is said to have conquered Ai. And so if it's the wrong site, then you won't find the evidence that you might expect from the biblical description of a site. And the ancient name of some sites are simply unknown. Many sites lack inscriptions or modern names that can help us identify where they were. And so that leads to ambiguity as to where those sites originally were. Another problem, archaeological interpretation involves a good deal of speculation and imaginative reconstruction, which can easily go astray. It's hard to tell whether a layer is Israelite or Canaanite. You have a burn site at a site. It's hard to know who or what burned that layer. Was it a war, or did a fire just break out and burn down the town? Even though you have archaeological remains, the interpretation of those remains can be ambiguous. There's at least 3 interpretations of a structure that was found on Mount Ebal near Shechem. This is what it looks like today, just a heap of ruins. The archaeologists Zertal argue that, well, this is the remains of Joshua's altar that was built there, according to the Bible. But then another archaeologist, Kapinski, argued that, well, no, it was just a building put on top of the hill. But then yet another archaeologist, Michael Kogan, said, well, maybe it was a Canaanite cultic site rather than Joshua's altar. And so, which is it? Well, the evidence is rather ambiguous. Another problem, archaeologists tend to hold non-evangelical presuppositions which can affect their interpretation. What you believe before you look at the evidence will affect how you interpret the evidence. Now, from the 1930s to about 1970, archaeology was dominated by the Albright School of Biblical Archaeology, and they tended to take a high view of the Bible and its ability to aid us in interpreting archaeological evidence. But many Israeli archaeologists today reject the Bible and so interpret the strata, quote unquote, on their own with no reference to the Bible because they, on other grounds, think the Bible is unreliable. Someone from the Albright School is going to interpret the Bible very differently than many modern Israeli archaeologists. And of course, evangelical presuppositions are closer to the Albright School, which was not quite conservative, but relatively conservative, much more with the Albright School than with the modern Israeli archaeologists today. Now, these are the major archaeological periods that archaeologists try to identify, starting with the Old Stone Age, which they date to before 10,000 BC. And then you have the Middle Stone Age and the New Stone Age. You can see the dates there. And the Chalcolithic period and the Early Bronze Age and the Middle Bronze Age. And then the Late Bronze Age, which is rather important because that's the time of the conquest, 1550 BC to around 1200 BC. The Iron Age would be the time of the monarchy into the post-exilic period. Then you have the Hellenistic period when the Greeks become influential, the Roman period, the Byzantine period, and then the Islamic period. These are all modern now. Crusader period, the Mamluk period, the Ottoman period, the British Mandate period, all the way to modern times. Now, dating an archaeological layer can be a challenge. And one needs to distinguish absolute dates versus relative dates. You can see in archaeological sites layers, the higher level is younger than a lower level. So as you dig down, you're going farther and farther back in time as they often rebuilt over the same site and just packed some dirt over it and rebuilt and left layer upon layer upon layer. And so, for the most part, with some exceptions, an lower level is going to date older than an upper level. And that will give you a relative chronology. But in order to date a level absolutely in years BC, you need more evidence. If you have wood or some other organic material there, you might be able to date that by carbon-14, which gives you a range of dates. You might have a datable inscription in a layer that would allow you to date it more absolutely. Perhaps you have a scarab seal that refers to a particular pharaoh of Egypt, and that might suggest a date at the time of that pharaoh, which on other grounds can be dated to the years BC. Pottery of similar styles are used to connect datable strata to those that are not datable. The way that they date layers in a relative way is by the archaeological assemblage of artifacts that they find, particularly pottery. If you find the style of pottery that's at the top of this chart, well, that's Byzantine period pottery. But if you go down and find pottery that looks like this, well, those would be Persian period pottery. And then you have Iron Age 1 and 2 and Late Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age styles. The theory is this, that pottery styles change over time. They change between sites. So if you go down layers, upper layer to lower levels, that change of pottery styles that they find in the layers will correspond from one site to another. So if you have an assemblage let's say, that looks like this Persian period assemblage in one archaeological site, and you have it in another archaeological site, well, that would be the same Persian period level. And from inscriptions or carbon 14 or whatever, you may be able to date that assemblage. Now, how do they do archaeology today? Well, they generally choose a site, and they'll dig in such a way so that everything gets recorded in situ, in showing exactly where it was when they found it. One of these methods is the Kenyon-Wheeler method. You lay out a site in squares 5 meters long, and then they have probe ditches, which are dug 1 meter by 3 meters to reach bedrock rapidly. And then they slowly and meticulously go down inch by inch, recording everything that they find as they go. This is very slow and very expensive, but it preserves the maximum amount of data. This is a dig in England, which illustrates the Kenyon-Wheeler method. Modern archaeology is multidisciplinary. A modern team of archaeologists will have historians, biblical scholars, stratigraphers, and ceramic experts, geologists, geomorphologists, climatologists, zoologists, physical and cultural anthropologists, ethnographers, historians of technology, technicians, computer programs, and the like. It's a very complicated process with many experts contributing to the process. One of the more important things that biblical archaeology has done for us is that they've revealed to us ancient writings. We've gotten cuneiform syllabic writings. Basically, they wrote in syllables. The earliest known writing is Sumerian, starting in 3100 BC. And then that writing system was adopted by people that spoke Akkadian. And dialects of Akkadian include Babylonian and Assyrian. And so they have inscriptions and writings using this cuneiform syllabic writing in Babylonia and Assyria, many of which relate to the inscriptions that give us synchronisms with biblical events. You also have the Hittite language in the same kind of script, and the Hurrian language, and Elamite and Amorite were also written in this cuneiform syllabic writing style. This was done generally on soft clay, and then when the clay dried, it became hard and preserves rather well over centuries and even millennia if it's buried in the right way. You also have Egyptian hieroglyphs, which have been helpful to us. This is not so much a Semitic language, but it's the second oldest written language, second to Sumerian. We have Egyptian hieroglyphs dating as early as 3000 BC. And we were able to decipher these hieroglyphs when Jean-Francois Champollion in 1822 found an inscription in Egyptian hieroglyph and in Greek that allowed him to interpret the Egyptian hieroglyph. There are also alphabetic writings. We found some alphabetic writings in the Sinaitic inscriptions, and then there's a language called Ugaritic, which is also alphabetic, and then Phoenician, and then Hebrew, Moabite, and Ammonite. They all use pretty much the same script, and then Aramaic, and then Greek and Latin and Arabic, all are alphabetic scripts. Syllabic scripts just have syllables for signs, and therefore you end up with 600 signs. But you have a much more compact alphabet if you only use an alphabetic form. Anyway, this is a chart comparing Ugaritic with Akkadian and Phoenician signs that show some of their connections. So anyway, this is our introduction to biblical archaeology and some of the ways that it helps us to understand the Bible better.